Hello and welcome to the session. This is Unit 4 in Week 1. Today's topic is about creating planning models in SAP Analytics Cloud. Data models are actually the core foundation of each and every planning application. And typically you should spend a lot of time designing the data model and making sure that all the business requirements can be kept. From a conceptual perspective, data models in SAP Analytics Cloud follow a so-called multi-dimensional modeling paradigm, similar to a cube in a data warehouse environment. In SAP Analytics Cloud, each data model consists of several dimensions and key figures or measures. The dimensions are used to capture a certain aspect of the values. So for example, if you plan revenues, you want to break it down by product, customer, and sales org, for example. In this case, product, customer, and sales org would be your dimensions in your Analytics Cloud data model. Typically, you create a data model for each planning application you create in the tool. So for example, if you create a sales planning application, you typically create a dedicated sales planning model. The same is true if you create a workforce planning application, so then you have a dedicated workforce planning, making sure that all the relevant dimensions and measures or KPIs are part of this model. For traditional reasons, the KPI or measures are called accounts in the data model of Analytics Cloud. So originally, the focus of Analytics Cloud was more on financial planning, and typically in financial accounting or in financial planning, you use GL accounts as your relevant measures, and this is why the account dimension was called account dimension. But in general cases, you can just think about the account dimension as your structure where you keep track of the different measures or KPIs. Some examples for dimensions are, as mentioned, time and product or version and location. On the measure side, we typically plan on revenue, costs, or sales quantities or headcounts. In SAP Analytics Cloud, we have a dedicated modeling environment for creating the different data models. So you don't need any external tool in order to model your planning model. The models can be created in 3 different ways. So first of all, you can start with a blank model, so meaning you define everything from scratch in the modeling environment. The second option allows you to create a data model based on a flat file you have on your local computer. So let's say you have a certain data sample representing the relevant structure, you can create a model based on top of this data. The third option allows you basically to create a model also based on a data model existing in a remote system. So for example, if you have a data warehouse system with a query, or you have an S4 system with the structures already available, you can connect to the system and create a model in Analytics Cloud based on these remote structures. The modeler is used for several things. So first of all, of course, you define the structures, so the dimensions and also the KPIs or measures, but you can also maintain certain central settings like currency translation and also the definition of the time dimension. We will come to this in a minute. Typically, you can also set up security, so we will look into this topic in a dedicated session, and you can also establish semantical relationships between the different dimensions. So this is a capability we will see in a second. And in the next session, we will also look into data imports, so the data management is also done out of the modeling environment. Now let's have a deeper look on the concept of the dimensions. As mentioned, dimensions are used to describe a certain semantical aspect of a data point. We had the example of revenue, which is broken down by sales org, product, and customer. Technically, dimensions or the dimension members need to have an ID, so a technical ID, which is unique for each dimension member in its dimension. You can provide a description, and then optionally, dimensions can also have custom properties and hierarchies. You can even create alternative hierarchies. So let's say for reporting purposes, this might often make a lot of sense. And in these scenarios, you can then create alternative hierarchies for a dimension. In SAP Analytics Cloud, there are predefined dimension types. So as mentioned, there is this specific dimension type called account dimension. So this is used to keep track of the KPI structure of your data model. Then every planning model has a time dimension. You can actually have several time dimensions, but at least you need to have one. And then by default, each planning model has also a version dimension, exactly one version, to keep track of different data categories, for example, plan, budget, and forecast data. And then optionally, you can also have a dimension of type organization in order to provide a certain organizational structure to your data model. And this organization dimension comes then with certain system properties, which can be used, for example, for currency conversion or in order to steer the process. All other dimensions are of type generic. And you can have basically an arbitrary number of dimensions in your data model. The members of a dimension present actually the master data, and they are typically loaded from an external system, either from a central master data governance system, like a data warehouse, or from an ERP system. Let me come back to this member validation combinations, or to the member combination rules in SAP Analytics Cloud. As mentioned earlier, it's possible now to create semantic rules on top of dimensions. So for example, if you have a dimension sales org and you have a dimension product and you want to sell only certain products in a particular sales org or in a particular region, so then from a technical perspective, it doesn't make sense to allow plan data to be entered on any combination, which is possible, but you want to restrict actually the combinations of product and sales org to a certain set of valid combination. And in the modeler, you can actually specify here in the rules section these kind of member validation rules. So in this example here in the screenshot, we have the dimension sales org and entity, and typically every sales org gets an assigned entity. So each sales org belongs to a particular legal entity, but of course a legal entity can have several sales organizations. And in this case, this is a so-called one-to-n relationship. And the regulation or the rule is here defined on an attribute at the sales org dimension, where every sales org then has the relevant entity as an attribute. And here in this rule definition screen, you can actually then define the valid member combinations, and the system makes sure that a planner cannot enter plan data on any other combination which is not valid. As mentioned in the beginning, the account dimension has a specific meaning in Analytics Cloud. It is used to define the KPIs or the measures of your planning model. So there are in principle two types of measures or accounts in this case then. So you can have the base members, which actually store the value. So for example, if you have gross sales as your base KPI, so then you store just the values for this KPI. But sometimes you also want to calculate based on these base KPIs, and then you can create here calculated measures or calculated accounts as part of the account dimension. And in this case, the system will calculate the values of these calculated accounts on the fly based on other KPIs which are defined as base members here in the data model. Very important aspect is that the values of these calculated KPIs are determined at runtime, and the results of these KPIs are not persisted in the database. So this is the difference to the base KPIs or the base accounts defined here in the account dimension. The formula or the rule for the calculation is specified here in the formula attribute of the account members, and you have also here access to more complex calculation logic. So we have here lookup formulas to read certain values. You can also provide here conditional statements, so you can specify certain complexity here in the account dimension for the calculated members. As I mentioned in the beginning, so you can do certain central settings for the model here directly in the modeling environment. So these settings relate to data access and privacy, so we cover this in a dedicated session. But you can also specify certain attributes of the time dimension. For example, if you use fiscal years instead of calendar years, so you can specify then the offset. For example, if your fiscal year starts in July 1st instead of January 1st, so then you can specify this here as an attribute of the time dimension. Another general settings here is related to the currency handling or currency translation, and this is where we have a detailed look. The concept of currency in SAP Analytics Cloud is attached to the system property, to a currency property, which you can switch on for a particular dimension. So let's say you have sales org as your organizational dimension in your data model, and of course each sales org has a particular local currency. and you want to allow people to plan in their local currency. For example, you want to have the Swiss sales org to plan in Swiss francs, whereas the US American sales org will plan in US dollars. And in this case, you can switch on the currency attribute for the dimension sales org, and then the system, or this has an impact how the system actually interprets and stores the number in the database. We will come to this on the next slide. The second important setting then, besides this currency attribute, is related to the rate table. So in the system, you can maintain actually several rate tables storing the currency translation rates. The rates themselves can be time dependent and version dependent, so you can have different actual rates from budget, or you can of course then also have different rates throughout the year. And the third important setting here is the date dimension. Of course, currency translation always has relation to the time at which you want to translate the values. And since the data model can have several time dimensions, you need to specify the time dimension which is relevant for the currency translation. And then the fourth parameter, or the last parameter you can do here in the settings, is related to the default currency. Since the system always translates at runtime from the local currencies into a reporting currency, you can actually maintain here default currency, and this is then used later on in the report to translate the local currency into this default currency or into this unique reporting currency. So now let's have a look how this is used then in a report or for the planner in the front end. So we have here in the screenshot our sales org dimension, and sales org here is used as the relevant dimension for the currency translation. You see that we have switched on here the currency attribute, which is appearing here as a fourth column here in the screenshot. And each sales org, of course, has its unique or has its local currency. For example, here the sales org SO001 has US dollar, whereas sales org SO002 has euro as the local currency. And this has an impact now as the data is stored in the database. So each value now, or each data point is interpreted as local currency, and the local currency is actually coming from the attribute of this sales org dimension in the database. And now if we want to report in the story, we need to specify which is our reporting currency. So by default, this is the default currency, which is set as a model parameter. So the system will translate the values on the fly from the local currencies, which are stored on the database, virtually into this reporting currency, which is the default currency, but can be any other currency as well. This is then up to the user in which currency he wants to see the report, or in which currency he wants to enter his plan data. And with this, I want to stop my presentation and jump directly into the tool so that you can see also the features I talked about here in action in an SAP Analytics Cloud system. So in order to create a new data model, I navigate to the main menu and then I select Create Model. As discussed, there are 3 different workflows how you can create a model, and I will start here with a blank model and create everything from scratch directly here in SAP Analytics Cloud. We see here now the modeling environment. Initially, of course, we just have a version dimension and by default a time dimension, since we always need to have one time dimension, at least in our data model. Now, as a next steps, I'm going to create additional dimensions here to my data model. I navigate to the toolbar into the edit section, and then I can actually either create a new dimension, or I can also add an existing dimension. And in this case, I would reuse existing master data in the system. So when I create a new dimension, I can basically select whether it's public or private, and public dimensions can then be reused later on. Here in our case, I'm going to create everything from scratch. So I create here a new dimension. I need to provide here a name for the dimension. I call this product, since I want to create here a data model for sales planning. So I'm going to create a sales org product and customer dimension, and then later on I create KPIs in order to plan cross sales and discounts and stuff like this. So here I select the dimension type. So in my case, the product dimension is just a generic dimension, so no specific attributes or anything attached to it. And here I can select whether this dimension should be public or private. As mentioned in the beginning, a public dimension can then also be reused in other models, and this way I can basically share master data between different planning models. Here in our case, the product dimension remains private because I do not want to reuse it later on in any other model. Once the dimension is created, I can select here in the dimension settings additional properties, or I can do some settings. So for example, I can provide here a description, and then I can also create additional properties or hierarchies. And here in our case, since the product dimension is structured in a hierarchical way, I want to create here a hierarchy for my product dimension. In general, there are two different types of hierarchies in SAP Analytics Cloud. So there's the so-called parent-child hierarchy, and then there's also a level-based hierarchy. In this case, I select here parent-child hierarchy, and with the parent-child hierarchy, for each member, we basically specify its parent member, and then the system can this way implicitly create the hierarchy from this definition. I give this a technical name, and then a description. I just call this here hierarchy in my example. Now I can open the dimension details. And here I will see then my dimension members. Initially, of course, there are no members maintained. I can now populate this dimension with the corresponding master data. In a real system or in a real scenario, of course, normally you load this master data from a central system. So this is actually also something we will see then in the next unit. But for now, I just copy over here from a local flat file. So I navigate here into my Excel spreadsheet where I've prepared the master data and just copy over my product dimension master data. So just do copy paste, and then I have populated my dimension here with the individual product IDs. We can also now have a look at the hierarchical structure. So I can navigate here to the hierarchy view. We see that we have here the total node at the top, and then I have my different product groups. So I have cross bikes, cruise bikes, mountain bikes, and so on. And then in the different product groups, I can further drill down until I come here to the lowest level, which is representing then my individual SKUs. So now let's continue. I'm creating my additional dimensions. So I will select here again add new dimension. Then I want to have, besides product, I also need to create a dimension for my customers. So I call this customer. I make it a generic dimension again, and again I can select whether this should be public or private. I choose here private again, so I leave this empty. For the customer dimension, I do the same. I actually create here a description, and this time I want to create a level-based hierarchy, and the level-based hierarchy is based on its attribute, and the attributes represent basically the level. So here for our customer dimension, I want to have attributes specifying whether the customer is a retail store or is a wholesaler, and whether it's then a large retailer or a medium retailer. And based on these attributes, I create then my hierarchy. So first of all, I need to specify here my custom properties before I can create this level-based hierarchy. So I just create here 3 attributes to represent the 3 levels of my hierarchy: L1, L2, and finally L3. So again, I navigate here to the dimension details, and then I copy over my customer master data from my Excel spreadsheet. Just copy paste here into this dimension settings. Now we see we have here populated also these custom properties, and now I'm going to create a hierarchy, a level-based hierarchy, this time based on these 3 different attributes. In order to do so, I go here to the dimension settings on the right, I pick create hierarchy, and then I choose level-based hierarchy this time. I create a new hierarchy, I provide a name, and then at the lowest level of the level-based hierarchy, there are always the member IDs, and then I create the additional levels on top using these custom properties. And you see now at the lowest level, we distinguish between medium retailers, large retailers, and wholesalers. And then on level 2, we distinguish between direct and indirect channel. And then at the top level, I have just one member, so one distinct attribute value representing now my total node. So then I create now our sales org dimension. Again, I pick generic and just make this a private dimension or keep it as a private dimension. I provide here in dimension settings a description. Of course, I want to have a hierarchy also for reporting purposes. And then I want to enable currency. So because every sales org should be able to plan in its local currency afterwards. So this is why I toggle on the currency property. This will now add here an additional system property to my sales org dimension. I also add here another custom property because I want to link my sales org to the particular legal entity, because maybe later on we want to translate or transfer the sales plan into a financial plan, and typically in a financial planning model you have the legal entity as the organizational dimension rather than the sales org. So I navigate here to the dimension members, and you see initially it's empty, but we have now additional properties. So we have the system property for the currency code, and then we have the custom property to specify the legal entity for each sales org. Again, I'm switching now to my sales org tab here in my spreadsheet. I copy over the values. And then I paste it here into my SSC modeling environment. So as a next dimension, I'm going to create this legal entity so that we also have it here and we can immediately derive it from the sales data. And this time I'm going to create here a dimension of type organization. I provide here a description. Again, I want to have a hierarchy. Also to be able to report the different regions. And then I create another property, this time country, also later on to build my report. So I navigate here again into the dimension members. And then I copy over from my spreadsheet. So at this point in time, we basically have a model with a version dimension, a date dimension, and then we have product, customer, sales org, and entity. And what is missing now are our business KPIs we want to actually plan on. So gross sales, for example, but also quantities, prices, and discounts. And for this, I create here another dimension called then the account dimension. So here I pick add new dimension. And this time I choose as the dimension type, I choose type account. And here I call this measure because this is not a financial planning application, but more a sales planning application where you have, from a terminology perspective, typically people use more the measure term instead of the account. So I provide here a description again. And then before I add the KPIs here into my account dimension, I want to switch on my currency conversion. So I navigate here to the model preferences, and then in the model preferences, I navigate to the tab for the currency settings. I toggle on the currency translation. You see here that I can specify default currency, so this is then used in the report to translate from the local currency into a reporting currency if nothing else is specified. Then we pick sales org as the dimension with the currency property. Since we have here 2 dimensions, I could also go for entity, but in sales planning, the sales organization is the leading dimension. And I can pick here a rate table. So you can see I can have here many in my system. So I pick this one, and since we just have one time dimension, I pick this dimension as the relevant one for the currency translation. So, and now I'm opening up here my account dimension, and I can now specify my KPIs. So again, I've also prepared this. So I'm going now to copy over from Excel and paste here into my account dimension. So we have here 4 different KPIs. So we can plan on quantities, prices, then derive the gross sales, and then also plan the discounts in order to get to the net sales later on. What we can see here is that some of these accounts are actually currency related. So if you scroll here to the right, we see that, of course, discounts, gross sales, and prices are related to currencies, whereas quantity, of course, does not have any currency. This way we can actually then control which of my KPIs are later on translated using the currency conversion. And now I can navigate back here to the overview page. At this point in time, we have now defined the structure of our data model. So we have here by default the version dimension, we have a date dimension, we have defined our KPIs in the account dimension, then we have product, customer, and sales org as generic dimensions, and we use here entity as the organizational dimension. So at this point in time, we have this structure. We have also the master data uploaded here just by copy and paste, and I can save my data model now. So I just give it a name. So let's call it just sales planning. I can provide here a description, and then I can save it here into the file repository of Analytics Cloud. As a next step, I'm going to create these member validation rules. In order to do so, we first need to switch this on. For this, I navigate here to the model preferences, and then I go to access and privacy, and then I will switch on here this toggle for the validation rules. I need to save this again. And then these tab strip rules should be enabled, and I navigate now into the design time for these member validation rules. I can create here a new rule. I call this sales org entity mapping, and what I want to establish now here is a combination rule between sales org and legal entity, because every sales org is assigned to exactly one legal entity. So it doesn't make sense to plan on any technical possible combination, but for sales org and legal entity, only certain combinations are valid. So I add here my sales org dimension. And this is where now the attribute entity is used, because via the attribute, we actually establish then the link into the entity dimension. And here I pick this attribute, so exactly this entity attribute we created just before, and this should match then to the dimension members or the dimension IDs or member IDs of my entity dimension. And you can see now the valid combination. So sales org US is only allowed to plan on the combination sales org US and entity 001. So I can save this rule. And now we have a data model in place, and as a next step then in the next unit, we will see how we can populate also transactional data now into this model. So stay tuned and hope to see you next time. Thank you and goodbye.